What's up guys, my name is Ace, and today we're going to be talking about some pretty big drama that happened earlier this week. I know it's taken me a little while to get to this video, but I wanted to put a little extra into it. Essentially, you guys may have seen this from Twitter. The official Call of Duty Updates account tweeted that they identified an issue that could result in erroneous visual blood effects when damage was not actually dealt while shooting at enemies in all modes. So essentially what they're saying here is for many people, they're running into situations where they shoot an enemy player, they get a blood spatter, but they don't get a hit marker. They don't actually deal any damage to that player. And they're claiming that that blood effect itself shouldn't be displaying, rather than that shot should actually be registering. And that obviously got a lot of people in the community very worked up because they feel it should be the other way around. If you're getting that blood effect, then you should also be getting a hit, and this is actually a hit registration issue, not a improper effect playing issue. So I do want to dive fairly deep into this topic, and I wanted to explain a little bit better how this client-side versus server-side stuff happens, since it's something I haven't really covered on the channel in many years. I have talked about this like back in the Black Ops 3 days, I think is the last time I talked about it. And I do see a lot of misconceptions around this, so I want to explain at least roughly how this works in an attempt to potentially explain what's actually going on here. And I do want to make a note, we'll be talking about this toward the end. Regardless of the explanation for this, I don't think it makes the situation any better. I think the communication on this was awful, and I still think there are some pretty serious connection-related issues. And I do think it's on the developers to not only better communicate when situations like this happen, but also to make very notable improvements to the connection experience overall. So just wanted to be clear on that one, not here to make excuses. I just see a lot of misunderstanding and misconceptions in the community as well, and I thought it'd be interesting to share some of this information on how this data is actually transmitted and what most likely explains what's going on with the situation, as well as the disconnect between the developers' communication and the community itself. And I do believe the primary source of the issue that we're seeing here is due to the fact that these blood spatters are generated client-side. And this is the part I really wanted to dive into and explain. You guys have probably heard that term before, client-side or server-side. And I did want to have a section on this video just talking about the basics of how this system works, because Call of Duty uses a server authoritative system. So let's dive into that. Well, when you're playing the game, your system is essentially running its own version of the game. So your console or your PC is running the game. Most of the aspects of the game are being run locally on that machine. And that means your system is doing most of the heavy lifting, and you won't see network-related delays for most of the actions that you're performing in the game. And with this, it also means many of the animations and visual effects are being generated by your system. So this is client-side. However, since we're in an online environment playing against other players, and every one of those other players is running their own version of that same match, all of those different versions of the game that everybody's playing, they're always going to be out of sync, at least to some degree, since we're in an online environment. And this is why we need a master game state, and that's run on the server. This is what the host is. And this is where all of the data from all of the players is collected and analyzed, and it's this master game state that has a final say in what happens in the match. And a quick aside on this is why kill cams and theater mode will often look so weird if you compare it to your live gameplay. This is due to the fact that kill cams are simulations of roughly what happened in the eyes of that master game state, with all these different perspectives that were obviously not perfectly in sync at the time, and these aren't a recording of what the enemy player saw in real time on their screen. So that's why you can never trust kill cams or the theater mode to be a perfect representation of what they saw on their end. But getting back to it, the best and easiest example of how this whole system works is shooting and getting a hit on an enemy player. In Call of Duty, when you shoot an enemy player and you are on target on your screen, you will send that data saying that you were on target and that you should be getting a hit to the server. Then the server will either accept that hit and apply damage, or they'll reject the hit and not apply damage. And that on-target hit can be rejected for various reasons. Typically, it's due to latency exceeding thresholds that they set, but it can also be rejected due to packet loss. Maybe that packet of information that you were sending to the server that said, hey, I got a hit here, maybe that never made it to the server, and therefore there's nothing for the server to analyze and you're not going to be awarded a hit. Additionally, another reason that hits are often rejected, or at least in the past this would happen more often, is the master game state already deemed that you were dead. It already accepted damage from a different player, indicating that your player was actually dead, even though that information hasn't reached you yet, and therefore that final shot that you fired right before you died, by the time it gets to the master game state and they analyze that, they say, oh, sorry, you were actually dead already, so you're not going to be dealing damage. Now, they can adjust thresholds on that and allow for a certain amount of kill trading, which they now do, but the situation still does pop up and it can happen. Now, obviously, anytime you do have a situation like this where on your end, you were on target, you shot the enemy player, it was very clear you were on target and should have got a hit, but you didn't get a hit marker because that shot was rejected, that obviously feels awful. And this is also a great time for a quick note. In Call of Duty, at least, the hit marker that you see appear, this is not generated client-side. This is actually generated after the host accepts the damage. And then you get to see the hit marker appear. And this is why sometimes you'll also see really delayed hit markers, where especially if you're on a high latency, you fire a shot and there's a very distinct delay before you get the actual hit marker. Or sometimes it feels like your first shot or two just aren't registering, when in fact those are the shots that are registering. It's just that you don't see the confirmation of that until 2 shots later. And this is why you can almost immediately feel when you're on a high ping without actually having to look at the ping yourself. But that is something important to know in Call of Duty. If you see a hit marker appear, that means you have dealt the damage. However, with this current situation in Call of Duty, the issue is we're seeing a blood spatter appear, so we're seeing an animation take place, but we're not getting that hit marker. And this implies that that blood spatter is being generated client-side. So your system is deciding to make that blood spatter happen because according to your machine at least, that should be a hit. But then for some reason, whatever happens with that data you sent to the server, that apparent hit is not actually accepted, and therefore you're not dealing damage. And from what I'm seeing, these situations have been popping up like crazy, especially since the launch of Season 1 with Black Ops 6. Now, personally, I haven't run into any of these scenarios myself, but I've seen tons of clips online. It is very clearly an issue that many people are experiencing. And this is where I wanted to take a look at some excellent testing and examples that were done. This testing was posted on Twitter by Freund, I hope I pronounced that right. And he went quite deep into this, doing some testing where he was simulating lag. So this situation is by no means a normal situation you should be experiencing in COD. He was pushing the limits on this by purposely delaying his outgoing packets, or the data that he's sending to the server, saying that he got a hit. And this very clearly shows that, at least in the game's current state, these blood spatters are being generated client-side, not server-side. And my understanding of this is these blood spatters were previously always generated server-side, so they were generated along with the hit marker. And that doesn't appear to be the case anymore, which is why we're getting all of these new situations pop up that previously never really popped up as a major issue with the game, whereas now it suddenly is a major issue, because at least on your end, it appears that hit should be registering. And we now have that very clear indicator being shoved in our face that, yeah, you should have actually hit that person, but you didn't because you didn't get the hit marker. Whereas previously, when this blood spatter was, at least I believe, generated server-side, not client-side, at least in those cases, you would shoot directly through somebody. And yeah, it would still be frustrating, but you wouldn't have that super obvious blood spatter shoved in your face that confirms that you should have got that hit and then you didn't get the hit. So this is why it's very understandable that the community had this reaction to that tweet from COD Updates, where they're basically just saying, oh, actually those blood effects shouldn't be playing, when obviously you'd be thinking, well, of course they should. I shot that person, they were on my screen, the blood spatter appeared to confirm that they were on my screen and I was on target when I shot, so why am I not getting a hit marker? And this is an issue with me not getting a hit marker, not me accidentally getting a blood spatter I wasn't supposed to get. Now, one other thing that Freund pointed out is your hitbox for generating a blood spatter doesn't always appear to align with your hitbox for getting an actual hit or hit marker on your target. And this is something you can actually test for yourself without having to simulate any lag or anything. So in a lag-free environment, you can actually make this happen right now. If you aim at very specific points on the body from a perfect angle, you can potentially generate a blood spatter without getting a hit. And this would absolutely be described as an erroneous blood spatter that shouldn't be appearing. However, you have to get the angle just right, and the tolerances on this are extremely tight as well. So I don't believe this is actually explaining many of the situations, or really any of the main situations we've been seeing, showing these blood spatters appearing without a hit marker appearing as well. And just a quick note on this, I don't believe there are actually separate hitboxes for generating this blood spatter versus receiving damage. And I think what's actually going on here when you see this particular situation is just due to that slight misalignment between first and third person. And the blood spatter is generated based on what's happening with your third person model rather than your first person model. And that's why this is only really going to appear when you're aiming slightly above your target in very close range situations. So I believe we can essentially ignore this particular aspect because I don't think this explains the real issue that's going on here. It's such an edge case thing and just doesn't properly explain what the community is experiencing. However, I do believe I have an explanation for at least all of the Warzone clips that I've seen so far showing this apparently erroneous blood spatter happening. And these clips were all compiled by Tactical Brit, and they were referenced in that community note for COD Updates. What I noticed with all of these clips is the player was beyond the hit scan range of the enemy when firing, and they weren't leading the target, at least not enough for that given range, when seeing these blood spatters apply. So at least in these specific examples, I believe what's happening here is that client-side generation of the blood spatter is not accounting for bullet velocity in the correct manner that the hit registration system is registering that velocity. I mean, I don't think it's any coincidence that most of these clips, at least, are on players that are parachuting or dropping down from the sky. and therefore moving very quickly, and this means the leading on that has to be very precise. But even with this one clip that went into slow motion, the player wasn't parachuting, but he is running laterally across the screen. This is clearly outside of the hit scan range of that weapon, and he's not really leading his target as you should be within those ranges. Yet, he is getting blood spatters when his point of aim is directly on target. And I believe in this situation, if those blood spatters weren't appearing, if it was working like it did previously, where, again, I believe those blood spatters were generated server side, I don't think we would be questioning this clip in the same way. Instead, we'd probably be saying, you're not leading your target enough. You have to be leading a little bit more there in order to get your hits. Also, when it comes to the Warzone clips at least, we do have to keep in mind they're running on 20-tick servers, and that's likely coming to the equation here as well, unlike with multiplayer where they're running on 60Hz servers. So I actually do believe that in these cases, in these clips that we're seeing here, that tweet from COD Updates is technically accurate since these blood spatters shouldn't actually be appearing because they're not leading their targets appropriately. However, I do think the way they communicated this was terrible, and therefore they're receiving a bunch of very rightful backlash for how they communicated that. Also, just to be clear, this doesn't make this look any less frustrating from the player's perspective. I think the reactions we're seeing here are very understandable. I would be reacting in the same way if I see blood spatter appear when I shoot someone in a video game, but I'm not actually dealing damage to them. So I'm not saying there isn't an issue here. There obviously is, but I think that issue should be properly explained by the developers rather than communicated in the way that they did on Twitter. And I also want to make it quite clear here. I'm not 100% certain that this is what's going on. However, based on my understanding of how things work in Call of Duty and what we're seeing in these clips, it does appear to be a very consistent and most likely explanation as far as I can tell. But we're not done yet. Another thing I wanted to point out is tons of multiplayer clips that have been popping up lately, like these ones here. And with this, in some of these clips, you can see the latency is very low. They are within the hit scan range of weapons, or the players they're shooting are standing totally still or not moving laterally to them at least. And therefore, they don't need to be leading their target in these situations. They're getting those blood spatters and they're not getting hits. And at first glance with these clips, I was like, holy crap, something's really wrong here. And yes, there is something that's really wrong here, but it's actually really easily explained. If you pay really close attention to the section of the maps that these players are on and where they are shooting, you'll notice something is missing in all of these clips. And it's almost always some form of a vehicle. Like in this one right here, this is the one that was totally mind-blowing to me. There's supposed to be a vehicle right here, and there is a vehicle right there, but it's not rendering on that person's end. And as a result, they're seeing enemies as if there's no vehicle there, and they're even able to shoot at them as if there's no vehicle there. And client side, it's not recognizing that vehicle is there, so blood spatter is appearing, but in reality, all they're doing here is shooting a vehicle that they can't see. So in these cases, it's not a hit registration issue. This is a totally different, but still very big issue of objects not properly rendering on the screen. And you guys might have also seen clips on Nuketown with the entire school bus not rendering for players. In that case, with the school bus, it doesn't block bullet damage entirely, and therefore you can shoot right through it. And it often looks like people have wall hacks when in reality on their screen, that school bus just didn't render. And this is obviously a very big issue that I hope they can get on top of. But it's not an issue of skill-based damage or shots not registering when they should be registering. It's a case of something in the way that's blocking those bullets is not rendering properly on their screen. So there we go. That's going to wrap it up for what I believe is going on, at least in these primary clips that I've been seeing with this whole issue of blood spatter appearing but damage not being dealt properly. At the end of the day, all of these situations look to be insanely frustrating to run into. I would be freaking out if I was running into this myself. And like I said, that brief explanation they gave on Twitter was far from good enough. That was not a good way to communicate what appears to be such a massive issue with the game. And therefore, I think they receive a whole lot of rightful backlash against that. And I think at this point, they really need to dive deeper and better explain what's going on here with some actual technical details, which I know many in the community will totally reject either way, but I'm personally curious, for instance, to know if I'm right here. Additionally, one final point I want to mention in this video is even though I think I have found some good explanations for what's going on in these situations, at the end of the day, I still think the connection quality in this game is subpar. It's not quite there yet. I'm still running into many games where I'm experiencing a lot of desync, especially when I play solo, for instance, in Black Ops 6. I don't know why this is the case, but when I play solo, my connection experience is way worse than when I party up. If I'm in a full party of 6, my connection is usually great. And that's the opposite of what you would typically expect, since when matchmaking solo, it should be just finding the best connection for you, whereas in a party, it should be finding the best average connection for your party. But that's just not my experience with the game. And at the end of the day, I really feel it's time to make some significant improvements to their server infrastructure. It seems like, if anything, the connection quality compared to recent years has gotten worse. And especially now that Microsoft owns Activision, I was really thinking they'd be transitioning into much better server infrastructure that they'd now have access to, but it doesn't appear that they're doing that. I believe they're using the same servers they've been using for many years now. And it would be really nice to see them take some real significant steps forward in this area. I think it's really time for Call of Duty to do that. Now, of course, those are all just my thoughts on this entire situation, and I'd love to hear from you guys in those comments down below. How are you feeling about this entire situation that's going on here? Do you think I may be right with what's going on in this situation or not? Do you think it's something else? Do you think it's actually skill-based damage or something else coming into play? And also, what's your general connection experience been like with Black Ops 6? Or I guess we can toss Warzone in here as well, since we did talk about Warzone a little bit today. Has it been good? Okay? Totally horrible? Just let me know down below. If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated. And don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.